Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we'll explore an important aspect of Taiwan's defense, the use of drones and the supply chains behind them. But first, we'll turn to Thailand and its recent election with insights from our two guests. Don't be confused today, as we are going to talk about Thailand and not only Taiwan. Since Thailand has gone through an election, let's see what it means for Thailand itself, and what it means for the Asia Pacific in general. To discuss the topic with us, Brian, Hioe, and Rath Wang. Brian and Rath, hello.
Thanks for having me.
Gentlemen, if I can just ask you to introduce yourselves.
I guess I'll start then. I'm Brian Hioe. I'm one of the founders of New Bloom magazine, which started in 2014 after the Sunflower Movement. So we write on Chinese politics as an independent media, and we also focus on cross-strait issues, regional politics, and also arts and culture.
And I'm Rath Wang here. I am in Taiwan, do different, roles in terms of political advocacy, and have lived in Thailand, the US, Japan, and here in Taiwan. And I've hosted shows, done, some work on international relations in relation to Taiwan and ASEAN and, Japan, of course, and the US, and have been labeled, many different labels, but, I see myself as a pragmatist and progressive.
Thank you both. And now we are going to talk about the election in Thailand. If we can just have an overview first of what happened during this election, maybe Raf, you want to start?
Sure. So I guess the so-called political establishment won the election. So, if you put it in simple terms, you would see Thailand as, staying put, status quo, nothing changed in terms of, pushing the country forward. Thailand has been labeled as, the sick man of Asia. So you probably would see, that sort of, what do you call it, naming continue. And Thailand has been, to give a bit of context, Thailand has been, the first US ally in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, because of, repeated military coups, it's been increasingly courting China at the same time. But Thailand has for centuries been um, doing this in terms of courting big powers, for its own benefit to stay independent. So you probably would see this continue. It probably wouldn't go full force into either way, the US or into China. But in terms of relations, with other countries, you'd probably see it, switching or bargaining in between, but not switching completely into either side.
Yeah, so it did result in a win for conservatives. And so that's a way in which I think not only was the status quo reinforced, but then progressives were defeated. And so the People Party, which is the latest version that the progressive Thai political actors have taken after having, for example, the Future Forward and Move Forward Party effectively dissolved through pressure from the government, there was a major win for conservatives. And so that is it points to where I think politics in Thailand stand. And I think a lot of the result was unforeseen, but skewed that way because of a war between Thailand and Cambodia. And that was initiated perhaps with the election in mind in that sense. It shows how a public can steer when it is in fact affected by nationalism in that sense. But I think the larger kind of geopolitical orientation of Thailand is not expected to change, as Rath mentioned, in light of that the status will continue. And this regional balancing act, that's something that is not particularly specifically Thailand, but that reflects the larger dynamics as well.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what Ryan said. But wanted just to add that what's interesting in this election is that you'd see the city, or the what you call it, the more, educated or informed, actually voted for, the progressive movement, which has, been the trend, I think, since the last election. But prior to that, it was more, people in Bangkok trying to protect, their interests, with older conservatives. But you see this movement where young people are actually for progress. So there is hope in terms of, future elections, that things could change. And the other interesting thing in terms of, populism, or it could be applied perhaps to Taiwan. Maybe you could disagree with this, but aside from nationalism, which was super powerful in this election, there was also a mix of changing deeds into changing property into deeds for farmers, where Thailand is a heavily agricultural country. So, the political establishment, the conservatives, use this, where in a traditional farmer base would be voting for progressives or for change. But because of these populist policies, they actually switched to the conservative side for things that they see as kitchen table issues. So I think this is probably something that, say, progressives around the world probably should take note, because these populist policies, even if employed by the right, could actually sway voters to go to the other side.
So there's a lot of interesting things that you are both mentioning here, and I'd like to circle back later on the geopolitical aspect, if only for general knowledge, because there's a big misunderstanding of what Thailand's position here is in the region. But to carry on what you are just talking about in terms of populism and democracy, it is true that we can kind of make a link with Taiwan, in which the two main parties are primarily defined by whether they see Taiwan as an independent country or as a part of China, whichever China they mean. But at the same time, a lot of voters are also growingly concerned about what you call kitchen table issues. And the Green Party here was supposed to be, or at least was perceived as the most progressive one, but little by little, its inaction in terms of cost of living or cost of housing is also causing it to lose momentum. Is this a parallel that you think is interesting?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I think across the world, we see that young people are really concerned about these bread and butter issues. And that's, I think, particularly true in Taiwan at a time which, for example, for a young person to afford a home in Taipei, you would have to not eat or drink for 15 years. And salaries are low, wages are high. Sorry, other way around. Well, hours are long, wages are low. And so that results in these issues, and that allows for sometimes the emergence of populist forces if they can, in fact, convince the public they will change the status quo drastically. And so in Taiwan, that's often been interpreted as leading to the rise of the Taiwan People's Party. In other contexts like Thailand, it is different in that sense because I think Taiwan's politics are very particular regarding cross-strait issues being the main dividing line between the major parties. But other contexts, I think it also shows that people sometimes that is what they care about, and not these fancy ideals such as democracy and progressive politics, and which are perceived as then rather remote from everyday concerns. And I think particularly for agricultural societies, that might be particularly extreme. You might have urban educated elites voting one way, but then those in the countryside vote a different way, and perhaps they just vote for a family whose last name they have heard for quite some time and who's been there for many generations as the local elected politicians. And that's also the dynamic in many parts of Taiwan too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that Brian mentioned. And the progressive side in Thailand was, I think, seen by a lot of Thai analysts that, being more around like the internet campaigning. I think that applies in Taiwan, which they call Kongzhan, which the DPP is very strong at, in terms of employing online, social media. Whereas people in the countryside are more like Brian mentioned, the family name, or either, policies, because they're mostly farmers. But what's interesting, I think, is that both are populist, because if you look at, the progressive side as, the People's Party, they talk about AI, they talk about improving wages. Thailand's wages, even for like white collar workers, are substantially lower than in Taiwan. So I think a lot of people want to see that change, and change in structural reform as well. All other things, in terms of Thailand's constitution, the power of the elite, the military, so on and so forth. But I think that's something that I think you can draw similarities with Taiwan, but in different senses in how they project their populism. But both parties that did win big, the first and second, are both employ populist policies, but catering to different groups. And I just wanted to go back to cross strait, because a lot are concerned that Thailand's moving towards China, but if you look at the numbers, they're also very friendly to Taiwan. Taiwan's largest embassy in the region is by far in Thailand, and outside of China, the largest number of Taiwanese expats are actually in Thailand, which is contrary to popular belief that, it's either Vietnam, Indonesia, or any other country in the world.
It is quite interesting because there was, for example, concern about Taiwanese being kidnapped in Thailand, and there was warnings from the Taiwanese government about that. And then the Thai government responded that, well, there are 200,000 Taiwanese living in Thailand, and that's no small amount. It is very large regionally. I think particularly for Thailand, which is heavily dependent on tourism, it does matter then to keep all sides happy in that sense. But I think this also reflects there's a strong tendency in Taiwan to perceive any regional election as a referendum on relation to China, which is how things are in Taiwan in terms of domestic politics, but not the case with other countries. And so, apart from Thailand, one saw, for example, headlines in particularly pan-green outlets that framed the Japanese election as also being a referendum on China, which I don't think it was, although we do see the China factor was probably more salient in Japan than I think with the Thai elections in terms of the recent vote.
Yeah, this is something I agree totally with you because also in reporting, I was mentioning recently how I have to fight these knee-jerk reaction that if a country is not 100% opposed to China in every possible ways, then it means it is 100% on China's side against Taiwan. But that's not true. It's a central issue for us in Taiwan, of course, but it's not the case for everybody else. Uh, and you are totally right to mention it because we hear this way too often also in analysis that one country is suddenly on China's side just because their leader has shook hands with Xi Jinping, which is not unnatural at the end of the day. It's not unusual for world leaders to go and talk to one of the most powerful men in the world. It doesn't mean that they are agreeing with him, and certainly not that they are agreeing with him on the status of Taiwan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not everyone's going to have a Justin Trudeau style confrontation with Xi Jinping when they cross paths with him in a meeting, for example. Now, that would be quite dangerous to many countries, in fact. And it's not like you're going to not shake his hand, perhaps, when you run to him.
Yeah, if you look at the interview, the first international interview that the current Thai Prime Minister had with Time Magazine after the election, you can see that the country is actually, well, not the country, the administration is trying to strike a balance between both the U.S. and China. Um, True, with Lunar New Year, the Prime Minister went to Chinatown, with the Chinese ambassador to Thailand, and had this big celebration. But a day before the interview, he just said that Thailand's most important security ally is the U.S. and that they want to keep it that way, and that Thailand's not picking sides between either. Brian mentioned the tourist things, so I think in terms of policy towards Taiwan, there shouldn't be much change. And a lot of politicians, senior ones, go to the Taiwan embassy. Um, it's by far the largest landmass in northern Bangkok, and they're very active in both political and economic circles in Thailand, very entwined. And if politics isn't a dichotomy. If you look at um, what many label the most friendly China company in in Thailand, they're actually by far the largest conglomerate. The CP Group. All of the chicken that comes to 7-Eleven in Taiwan comes from that company, and all his children, not all, but most of the children went to school, primary school, elementary, to college in Taiwan, and they're both very friendly towards Taiwan.
Yeah, it's also rather interesting. We talked a lot about the younger progressive politicians, for example. That's also been the case where some Taiwanese young progressive politicians have met with their counterparts in Thailand. For example, Lai Ping-yu, the former DPP legislator who emerged from the Sunflower Movement, actually met with PETA, the leader of the Move Forward Party, because she has an interest in Thailand and spends a lot of time there
He was just
since
here,
leaving
right? I think.
office. Yes, he was just here. Actually, I saw him at a book signing event at the Taipei International Book Exhibition, and so his book about how he was removed from office despite that he would have become the prime minister is a best-selling book, in fact, and so that also shows this interest. And he came and he talked about his past meetings with anyone from Audrey Tang to Morris Chang, and so that was quite interesting. That was literally on the day of elections as well. So he seemed quite hopeful at the time, and I'm sure a few hours later, turned out to be completely the opposite.
That's a great point, and I just wanted to add that even though they lost, they're the second party. But if you look at partyless votes in Thailand, the Progressive Party that came to Taiwan, they actually by far won the most votes in all of Thailand. So there's still a huge momentum. It's like when you look at parties in Taiwan, the DPP, the KMT, um, the Progressive Party won by far, the highest tally in this election. So it's not like, they're going anywhere anytime soon.
So it seems like Taiwan has actually quite a solid relationship with Thailand. And as we just said, an election in Thailand will not consider Taiwan as a central issue. Now, to speak more broadly about Thailand's diplomacy, you just started the conversation by mentioning how Thailand tends to keep some sort of equilibrium between the US and China. But then again, this makes me think this is pretty standard for the region, isn't it? A lot of ASEAN countries are like this. Like, we can say the same about Indonesia, about Singapore, about even Vietnam, can't we?
I think the uniqueness about Thailand is around that, it's kept its independence from Western imperialism in that sense, because it likes to play different powers together. Thailand used to own, or you could say occupy, or controlled most parts of Cambodia, of Laos, and it gave that to France, and pitting it, against these countries, against, like, say, the UK, the British back in the time, playing powers against each other. So to play this game, to stay independent, and it's been the only independent country in the region from Western imperialism. It claims that it was, independent from Japan, but if you look at the reality, that's actually, not totally accurate, because Japan effectively governed it for around 5 years, and was it basically helped Japan expand into Burma as well. The Thai forces were helping the Japanese, but after the war, I think was less than a week, history was twisted by Thai politicians saying, hey, that never happened because it was a different person in government, and basically invalidating all those 5 years. But basically, I think this is very pragmatism at work, how slick or whatever, but this formula has worked for Thailand. And it's a combination of political diplomacy, applying the junta, military junta at times, and also, the royal establishment, all in combination of crude pragmatism for survival. I guess you could say it's similar for other countries, but I think Thailand is a very extreme case.
Yeah, it is. It is very interesting because I think it does illustrate that Southeast Asia is in fact conscious of threats from China when there has been some version of China, often pre-modern Chinese empires next door for literally millennia. And so I think that also is maybe another factor that often will reinforce military ties with the US, because you don't want to be reliant on what is your largest regional threat in that sense. You see this also with, for example, let's say Singapore, which often will train troops in Taiwan than China because of the fact that, well, that is another team in the region that you're concerned about potential threats from.
Yeah, and how to say, what does this mean for the ASEAN also as a whole? What are the reactions around the ASEAN? What do you think that the election can mean from an ASEAN perspective?
I think from ASEAN as a whole, there shouldn't be too much change, because there's a traditional policy of non-interference in each other's countries, internal politics. But the large influence that you could see is actually Cambodia, because for better or for worse, nationalism has been used by the conservative force, against Cambodia. I think you could see both sides at fault, Thailand and Cambodia. But if it's been utilized as a campaign issue, by both Cambodia in terms of wanting, more peace, and the Thai conservative factions by using, more attacks on Cambodia, to strike nationalism to win that. So you would see this aggression, or hostility towards Cambodia probably continue. I wouldn't go to extreme to say would increase substantially. And in terms of Burma, I think you would see more non-interference. The current prime minister has mentioned that there'd be more support from Thailand in terms of monitoring elections or humanitarian aid, even though he has mentioned that he doesn't support any killing by the junta. One doesn't know how much of that is lip service. So I think on that front you'd see the status quo. And in terms of China, I think you know Thailand might set an okay example for those who want to tag both sides in terms of, you know, China with China on a friendly stance, but not being takeover, say, as you've seen the likes of Laos and Cambodia, because Thailand is part of their economic whatever trading, but Thailand refuses to take in Chinese capital when it comes to infrastructure or all these other things. So they're freed from what do you call it, that debt trap, which a lot of other um, Southeast Asian or African countries go into. I think Malaysia also applies a similar approach, where the former Prime Minister Mahathir and his successor refused to let China own the railway that they are building, in concerns of the debt trap.
Yeah, I think particularly ASEAN, the role is quite limited often. ASEAN has, of course, many members who are military juntas. And so I don't think there's particularly concern about when there are conservatives that are aligned with militaries retaining power in that sense. But then I think particularly regarding Myanmar, that's an example of how when there was a conflict zone, ASEAN did very little. And oftentimes consensuses such as the 5-point consensus were viewed as then rather late and actually ineffective in that sense, and then unable to resolve this conflict. China's, of course, a major stakeholder, but I think ASEAN is, as a whole, navigating that tension. But I think particularly contentious may be the issue of scam centers, which China itself is intending to clean up because many of the people targeted are its own civilians, civilian population. And that also it affects, I think, many of the countries that do have scam centers on their border. For example, with Thailand, it'd be on the border between Thailand and Myanmar. So that may come up more as an issue, I think.
And in terms of tourism as well, I think just to add to what Brian said, there have been less number of Chinese tourists that came to Thailand, I think last month because of, the scam center warnings and all that in China. Also because, their economy isn't doing as well. There are less tourists coming out. But, the number that economists have projected in Thailand actually has, been less than what they have projected in terms of tourism from China. So that's also another concern.
And now here we are talking about what Thailand does and the way that Thailand does diplomacy. But what will China do? What is China's policy towards Thailand? Did you observe any actions from China towards Thailand?
Well, China met with invited the king. I think it was the first time in many decades that the king of Thailand has visited China. And, the prime minister, which is very pro-establishment, pro-military, accompanied him, I think just a few months ago to China. So you've seen that. But in terms of actual policy, um, even though China will try to lure more, give more treats to Thailand in terms of the, cared approach, it's hard to say, it's hard to see anything substantially in terms of, Taiwan policy, because Thailand and Taiwan enjoy a very strong relationship, in terms of people to people, business. So what you could see more of is maybe lip service from the government. You've seen that with the former prime minister, the daughter of Thaksin Shinawatra. Um, I think that outraged many in Taiwan when she went to China, or well, she met with Xi Jinping and said that Taiwan is a part of China and that there's only one China, which is the People's Republic of China. Many view that as she asking her to do it, so she did it as a lip service favor. So you might see things like that come out, given that the current prime minister has a friendly relationship with China, even though he spent about 10 years in the US. So it seems that he's friendly to both, but seeing him cave in totally to China's carrots, I think is far fetched.
I think so as well. I also don't anticipate much changes there. I think it's, again, status quo reinforced, and I don't expect that relationship with China to change either then.
You don't think that China is going to do anything specific or anything different with the new government in Thailand?
I think they know the limits in Thailand. So, I agree with Brian that, there's not going to be much change. But what they could do is, try to build more things to the region, to, what many call their vassal states, which might be, not 100% accurate, but, in terms of, the actions that follow by those smaller governments. yeah, such as in Laos or Cambodia, which are connected to Thailand. And maybe, behind the scenes, you can see, more things in terms of, its support for Burma, and Thailand probably staying silent, which is, you know, what it's been doing for quite some time in terms of, which is in line with the policy of ASEAN to not interfere with other countries' internal affairs.
I think so as well. I think particularly the war with Cambodia showed that China would not have gone intervene in that, for example, on the side of a state that is much closer to it. And so I think that also shows the stability of then relations with Thailand.
And what about Taiwan then? Because we know that Taiwan used to apply what was called the southbound policy, which was the initiative of the previous president, Tsai Ing-wen. Now we are 2 years into the presidency of her successor, Lai Ching-te. What do we observe Taiwan doing towards the ASEAN in general and towards Thailand in particular? And also, do you see any differences between the way Lai is handling it compared with Tsai?
Interesting. I do think that Lai is less focused on the new southbound policy than Tsai, because I think particularly Lai has enjoyed, and as also occurred during the tail end of the Tsai administration, stronger relations with the US. And so I think particularly a focus on South Asia has not been as important. But I think the usual efforts at cultural diplomacy continue, as well as in terms of building economic ties, because there's a lot of focus on, for example, non-red supply chains, having supply chains that are not linked as much to China. And I think the deterioration of cross-strait relations, as well, concerns about China's actions in the region, and perhaps that Taiwanese businesses be arbitrarily targeted, that led to much more Taiwanese businesses then moving their investment elsewhere. And so some has gone to Southeast Asia, for example. But in the meantime, we also do see very large investments from the tech sector, particularly TSMC in the US, in terms of semiconductor fabs and the like.
I think when it comes to Thailand in particular, my other role that's government related, we do see more investment coming into Thailand, and you see large, as Brian mentioned, there's a focus on semiconductors, companies related to, semiconductors building more factories in Thailand. Not the super high end ones, that are being built by TSMC in Arizona or in Kumamoto in Japan, but more of, the say down in the supply chain that are less technological advanced, are being expanded in Thailand in terms of manufacturing capabilities. There's a high demand for talent down there in terms of Taiwanese companies. So I think that will continue, and Lai probably has less of a focus on Southeast Asia, but I think in terms of moving from the red supply chains, Southeast Asia, including Thailand, is a huge place for that. And you see emphasis on promoting more economic investment as well. And Taiwan has been one of the top, continues to be one of the top investors, especially when it comes to um, AI related to medical or medical devices in Thailand. Thailand is one of the top Asian countries for medical tourism, and Thailand plays a huge role in that. And I think you see the Thai ambassador, de facto ambassador representative in Taiwan, increasingly promoting this area. And I think you'd see more cooperation in that sense. But in terms of say southbound or these highly visible campaigns, I'm not sure if we're going to see another one. As Brian mentioned, there's a more focus on the U.S. and defense, which, yeah, I think probably is a bit far from ASEAN at this point.
Why exactly is there such a change? Is it due to Lai Ching-te himself having different views from Tsai Ing-wen, or is this the circumstances are different, or a mixture of both? Because even if we think that there is a focus on defense, we know that military presence in the region is not just a one-way relationship. It is interlinked with all countries in the region, from Japan to farther south. So how do we explain that there is such a change in attitude from Taiwan towards the countries that lies southwards of it?
I think it's mostly just a basis on the timing and circumstances, where Lai has benefited from just the US being stronger in support of Taiwan. I don't think there would be less emphasis on the new southbound administration, kind of a policy under his administration, otherwise. But it's also interesting because I think Thai particularly did have an interest in expanding to other places as well. For example, there was an attempt to launch something similar to the new southbound policy for Africa, and that was rather belated in being thought out and worked out. And so that really didn't really go that far. But I think Lai hasn't really done that much in terms of coming up with new diplomatic strategies, say, but rather banking on the relation with the US and trying to shore up defense. So that's also a way in which, because the times are different, his priorities are then also different than Tsai's.
Yeah, I think it feels that Lai is very focused on AI. I think countries that could benefit from that, you see, India, you see, say, Thailand, Malaysia. Malaysia, of course, because of northern Malaysia has lots of, semiconductor related companies. So, there's an emphasis more on that than, and yeah, I agree with Brian. I think it's more of a timing issue. And, but there might be a bit of an element to differentiate, his presidency, from what Thai has been pushing. So, but I also agree that the policy hasn't changed in terms of southbound. I mean, the funding, the focus, the personnel working on the region is still there. It's just the marketing is probably in a different part now. But if you want to talk about Taiwan, I think there are many issues at hand that I think the administration could focus on. Not just defense. In terms of as we started the podcast in the beginning, in terms of people's livelihood, I think that would be something that could be more talked about and enforced.
Yeah, this is something that I personally tried to talk about a lot when I was myself interviewed on the Taiwan Talks TV program last month, I believe, where I was insisting that the economic well-being of the Taiwanese people is also a matter of national security, because we are living in a country now that is getting richer and richer, reaching the highest revenue it ever had. But all of this seems to be limited to a very small part of the population that works in tech and semiconductors and chips and AI, and the rest of the population is growingly impoverished, and this will have consequences in terms of how they vote, and the way they vote also determines national security.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the way in which economic security dovetails with national security in that sense.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the region, I think apart from nationalism, a lot of it was, done through populist parties. I think whether left or right, you may not agree with it, but populism can become very powerful. I think it's something that you want to see visible. I think we talked about Japan before on your show, and I think, a lot of the people, not just for Japan's security or dignity or, whatever, is in the campaign messaging, but a lot of it is economic security. So I think people want food on the table, want to feel safe. They want, their children, grandchildren to be able to have a good life, have savings, to live securely. I think a large section of the population doesn't feel that way. There could be, profound influences on how, one votes and what, party, they affiliate with.
Well, let's hope this message is heard. Well, what could Taiwan do then to improve the livelihood of its most vulnerable citizens and its youngest citizens?
Well, I think one would be perhaps there is this increased windfall that Taiwan is seeing in terms of taxes, for example. And so there's been some discussion of distributing that to the general public or increasing social services. But I think that even in spite of the tax windfall, that is because of the boom that Taiwan is seeing in terms of the tech sector. But there is a lot of wealthy people in Taiwan that could perhaps do with more taxes. And I think that would be ways to either redistribute wealth or increase social services. So that's definitely one way about it.
Tax for sure. I think tax in terms of compared to other countries, Taiwan has one of the lowest rates. So I think, I completely agree with Brian on that. And I think one important thing is to listen to the people. I think, the government could listen more to surveys, in terms of what the people want. I think, from talking to people, I feel, what's ingrained in Taiwanese society is having the ability to buy a home. I think people don't want to rent very small, crappy apartments. They at least want somewhere, not super big, but big enough. I think being able to provide that, I think Thai started with public housing, but there's still far, far less supply for the demand out there. And also, having control on, say, going back to what Brian mentioned, tax, I think, in terms of keeping the prices down, because um, when you sell a house, the tax that you pay on that is very, very low compared to other countries. That encourages people to do, use housing as investments. They keep it for a few years and sell it. So, discouraging that would be another thing, in terms of housing affordability, increasing the supply, and I think marketing it in a way that is effective. I think listening to such demands, or, it could be like, say, if you look at the case of Japan, what, the parties used was taxes on food, bringing that down because, they did a survey repeatedly in the last year or two, and most people felt that, food on the table was expensive, groceries were expensive. So I think the government could look at, the case of Japan, where, Japan did surveys in the past year or so. People were most concerned about grocery prices, going to the supermarket, not being able to buy as much food to the table as much as they could. So in the case of Taiwan, that could be housing, whatever that is, leverage that, to make sure the people, can be economically viable and feel safe and secure. And I think that applies to many countries, Taiwan for sure. And also, we just talked about Thailand. We'd seen how, the farmers were most fixated on owning property. And, the conservative forces really leveraged that along with nationalism to win the election.
All right. Well, Rath and Brian, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Julian. Appreciate.
We hear more and more about drones in warfare, and of course this creates both anxiety and hope in Taiwan. Anxiety about how China could use them, and hope that they could become an affordable and effective part of Taiwan's defense. So let's take a closer look. Andrew Koch, founder of Nexus Pacific, has observed a growing trend towards startups working in the drone sector.
I just think that there's a lot of overlap there. There's a lot of dual use spaces I play in, and one of them is called space domain awareness. And I see every time I go to meetings or conventions, I see a lot of Taiwanese space startups starting to play. So I see more space cooperation. I see them cooperating along, drone fronts, other things like that. So I just, that's how I think they're kind of really becoming, kind of interlinked.
This is our first clue. The drone industry differs from other defense industries, and so does procurement. Dr. Jyh-Shyang Sheu is a specialist on drones at Taiwan's Institute for National Defense and Security Research.
There is a lot of discussion about the Taiwanese drone procurement. So first of all, currently the Taiwanese Ministry of National Defense is set in total 5 different types of drones which Taiwan want to procure. From type 1 to type 5, and it's included some relatively larger scale of professional military drones, and also till some quadcopters or like kamikaze drones and so on. So there's a different type of drones which Taiwanese armed forces will procure. But that is mainly for ground forces. In the near future, Taiwan is also discussing to introduce a lot of different drones like from Sheu AI, from Andrew, or some different Western companies, basically from United States, but also lots of technologies and drones from Europe. And we are trying to, not only procure that from Western countries, but also trying to have some local production, and also to connect the Taiwanese domestic supply chain with the global supply chain for the drone industry.
I forget the exact number, but Taiwan is trying to, procure several 100,000 drones by 2030. And they're trying to, maybe it was $1 billion they announced in the last couple months to spend on drones. So they're another piece of the pie where, all sorts of small startup companies are trying to develop small attritable drones that can operate near the equator, with long distance, given what a conflict could look like in the South China Sea.
In South China Sea, I think there's a couple of possibilities, but in South China Sea, first of all, that should be a relatively larger scale drones, which means it could stay for the endurance should be longer than couple of not only couple of hours, but maybe also longer. Currently, of course, Taiwan is very much focusing on to strengthen our maritime domain awareness with different approaches, and drone is a part of it. So, for instance, the Taiwanese Coast Guard is trying to procure drones for their maritime operations. That is also because of the Chinese gray zone harassment, and I think South China Sea is a possibility of that. But actually, what Taiwan is focusing on is actually a much more comprehensive maritime domain awareness. So that means the neighboring area, including the South China Sea, but also Taiwan Strait, the eastern part of Taiwan, which is West Pacific, and so on.
This brings us to one argument often heard in favor of drones for Taiwan. They are widely perceived as a cheaper and more affordable defense solution. That matters greatly for a small country facing a much larger adversary. But to what extent is that perception accurate?
We are trying to cut the red supply chain, but of course not every single Taiwanese company, which is in 2022, if you remember some news report, you might remember some Taiwanese company already supplied some small drones to Ukraine at that time. For instance, some of them don't really focusing on to cut the red supply chain because their audience, while they're focusing on their customers is mainly maybe from global south, from third worlds and another countries, which they don't really need to cut the red supply chain. So they don't focusing on Western country or Taiwanese government's use. So this kind of companies, they might remain how they work like in last years. But for those who want to, make connection, gain the orders from the Taiwanese government, military, Coast Guard, police, and also from the Western countries. Those companies will much more focusing on to have our own local ecosystem. Maybe some of the spare parts, maybe some of the component might import it from outside. For instance, if we need some high quality EO/IR sensors and so on, and maybe we need to import it from Europe. So, but all in all, we are trying to create a non-red ecosystem.
One of the things I hear a lot about on the drone front is that, because this is also about bringing the cost down, because you can't spend, $1 million to shoot down a $400 drone, and most of the cheap components are Chinese. There's a real effort to start to in addition to the stuff people talk about, rare earths or heavy metals or all these other things, but just supply chain diversification. I think Taiwan and Japan are going to play off each other as deterrents in that way. And I will say, the U.S. is also trying to have, National Defense Authorization Act compliance for drone manufacturers, and the regulatory walls are rising where you're going to need to have less and less components coming from the PRC. So as Taiwan and Japan, put a lot of money, billions of dollars behind building out new drones to counter China, they're also building out the supply chain that, the US is going to play off of. And then, I see Taiwan becoming a little bit more nested in security architecture. So I think all those things are just kind of mutually reinforcing.
In last years, we already have a lot of delegations from the United States, from Europe, to discuss about the possibility to integrate the drone supply chain. And of course, we see some outcomes in recent 1 or 2 years. So, for instance, in last September, in the Taipei Defense and Aerospace Exhibition, there is already the German company of Rath already signed an MOU with the Taiwanese drone industry for some certifications. And also recently, the United States also have similar things with E3 to create for the test and so on to verify the Taiwanese drones will be so-called blue drones, which is non-red supply chain and a safe from the cybersecurity is also safe enough and so on. So this kind of things is something of course we are trying to do. And also if you look at the statistic, there is already some outcomes of the Taiwanese drone export. I think the top customer, the top one is actually Poland, and the second one is United States, and the third one is Germany. And of course, regarding the numbers, it was still not that huge enough. For instance, for Germany, it was around, so far as I know, around 10,000 drones and so on. Well, if you look at the drone uses in the battlefield or in civilian uses, of course, the civilian or the civilian market is another issue, the commercial market. But when we are talking about the military use, just in the Ukrainian battlefield, every month Ukraine and Russia might lose more than 20 or 30,000 of drones, which means 10,000 drones is only a small part of it. But I think that is a good beginning because Taiwan has in Jyh County a drone cluster where we call it 无人机国家队, which means drones national team. And of course, there are still some companies not good, not really went to the cluster, but there are already some lot of companies there. But most of them are startups, which means they are relatively small companies and just in the very beginning phase. So they need to increase their capability of productions and so on. But I think we have a very good beginning.
According to Dr. Sheu, Europe plays an important role in the drone supply chain.
I think the relationship between Taiwan and Europe is also strengthening in recent years because of the war in Ukraine and the aggressive policy of China and so on. So all in all, we are strengthening the cooperation with Europe firstly, and secondly, when you are talking about the drone export. So first of all, the top one buyer is Poland, and the third one is Germany, and we are not sure who will be the end customers. So that means it might be the authority. Might be the law enforcement, military, but might also be that they are procuring drones and sending it to Ukraine. So we don't know, but I think there's a lot of possibilities, and the cooperation between Taiwan and Europe is strengthening now. So not only the United States, but the European partners.
And to conclude our dive, let's hear a concrete story of drone procurement.
For instance, the company Rath is signed the MOU with the Taiwanese drone industry, so they will support the certification, which means the cooperation of drone production might be a possibility in the near future. That's because if Taiwan can get enough certification to entering the European market, then of course it's also much easier to export the entire drone subsystem or component. And that could also strengthen the European drone supply chain because when talking about commercial drones, everybody will think about the Chinese the Chinese brand DJI because DJI captures around 80% or even more in the global market. I mean, they are quite huge, and the Chinese company is offering a very cheap drones comparing with the European one or American one, and also good performance. So so that is of course a problem for the democracies. But when people are thinking about the manufacturing, well, you will find that the Taiwanese environment of manufacturing is very similar like in China. So that means if people want to create another drone ecosystem to counter the Chinese drone industry, maybe Taiwan will be the best place to do that because we have very similar environment. In fact, when people are talking about Shenzhen, the Chinese manufacturing city, mega city in that sense, actually a lot of business model or the concept and so on was built by the Taiwanese businessmen maybe 3 or 4 decades ago. That means I think this kind of cooperation for drone manufacturing between Taiwan and all democracies, maybe not only US or Europe, maybe also in other countries like Japan and so on, might be possible if we want to do something to counter the authoritarian regime.
We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.